at communicable diseases. If you've seen any of my GCSE videos on this, you'll see that we've covered this in some detail already, but in this I want to look and take this a little bit further and have a look at some of the mechanisms behind what's going on and some of the problems that we face. So let's get in and start having a look at the different types of pathogens and what they do. So our pathogens that we need to consider are going to be, firstly, and the most important I suppose, are bacteria. There are probably more bacteria than any other type of organism. Which is quite a frightening thought. Just a small proportion of these are pathogens. In other words, things that cause a communicable disease. So the bacteria here, they are prokaryotes. In other words, they have a single cell structure that's very different from the eukaryotic organisms that they're actually going to infect. Basically, they have just a piece of DNA. They have this membrane, and this is perhaps the weakest point of a bacteria. They basic shapes, they've got rod shapes, which are called the bacillus, the spherical ones, the cocci, the comma shaped ones, the fibulos, the spiral ones, the spirella, and we've got some also some corkscrew ones. So there are quite a lot of different shapes, but basically they come as two sorts, and we identify them with this sort of cell wall. And the cell wall is either going to come out as being something which is called gram-positive, and these basically look under gram staining, they basically look a sort of a purple blue, or they are gram negative, and in which case they appear sort of red. Gram positive would be probably our Staphylococcus aureus, our famous MRSA. The gram negative, on the other hand, something like the gut bacteria, something like E. coli. And this is because the cell wall here affects how bacteria react to different antibiotics. So there are two particular different sort of cell walls. And in fact, some of the bacteria can behave sort of differently. If I've got one bacterium, then here it's possible to kill fairly easily. But if we can get a group of these bacteria, and this is where they've grown, what they can do is they can grow a slime wall around them. And this slime wall is really much more impervious to antibiotics and all sorts of other mechanisms of killing them. So this is just one species of a bacterium, and by itself it's relatively easy to kill, but once they can start to produce a slime wall, then they're really hard to get rid of, and we need to find different means of drug delivery to try and get rid of these sort of slime walls, because it's a challenge to get through the slime wall, and then once we've got through that, to actually kill the bacteria. So this requires a sort of more of a two-pronged attack. So viruses are our next stop along the way, and people are starting to learn more about viruses. They're very much in the news at the moment. These are simply a real problem because they are non-living infectious agents. And many people find it very hard to understand why you can't destroy something like a virus. But if it's not alive, you can't kill it. You can't modify, I suppose, the simple environment to try and get it. Viruses basically only work by invading living cells. And once they're in there, then their genetic material takes over the biochemistry of the host, and that makes adaptations to the host, which makes these really very successful pathogens. They are really easy to identify, I suppose, outside, but inside a cell they're protected by the cell. Just about all naturally occurring viruses are pathogens. They cause disease in every other type of organism. They attack, the bacteria, no problem at all, as well as all the sort of eukaryotic life, plants and animals. If they invade a bacterium, then we would know this as can't even think the word, bacteriophage. They take over the bacteria cell and they use them to replicate themselves, and they destroy the bacteria at the same time. Now, it is possible to start using these to attack, I suppose, the bacteria. So we think of these viruses as the ultimate parasite, and very difficult they are to try and destroy. The next type is the protist. Now, these are a group of eukaryotic organisms with basically a wide range of feeding methods, but basically all of them really are single cell. Some of them, I suppose, work as colonies, and then they create the same problems that the bacteria also do, that they are difficult to kill as single cells, but then when they become colonies, they become basically really devastating. So they basically use people or animals as their feeding grounds, and many of these require vectors to try and help them moving on. And the obvious ones here, malaria and perhaps sleeping sickness being probably a couple of the most commonly known. I suppose another one is amoebic dysentery. As a way of sort of killing off things, they're pretty effective. The last group are the fungi. Fungal diseases are basically not a major problem in animals. So they are irritating, but not necessarily so much life-threatening. And we see a few of these, like thrush, which simply is sort of a single cell invasion. But fungi are simply basically some sort of plant that can't photosynthesize, so they digest their food extracellularly. And before absorbing these sort of foods, they actually have to try and sort of release some sort of chemicals that are going to destroy you. Generally, most fungi are saprophytes. They feed on dead and decaying matter, but some are parasitic, such as thrush here, feeding on sort of living organisms. Fungi are really, however, devastating on plants. So on plants, these are a major problem, and they're simply a major problem because they usually end up stop photosynthesis. And if you stop photosynthesis in a plant, well, that's going to quickly kill the plant. And when the fungi reproduce, they produce millions of tiny spores which spread huge distances, and they go off and kill all types of things there, moving on from one to the other. So how do we get some of these working? Well, let's have a look at what they really try to do inside. So if we look at our simple modes of action, then basically let's look at first of all the virus. The virus basically takes over all the cell metabolism. So if it's taken over all the cell metabolism, the viral genetic material has got into the host cell, and it's inserted itself normally into the host DNA. The virus then uses the host cell to make new viruses, and the best you can hope for here is this cell can, before it's taken over entirely, can put up a distress sign and say, please come and kill me. How about the protists? Well, some protists take over cells. They tend to break them open. And basically they take over the cells, they break them open as a new generation appears. But they don't take over the genetic material. They simply digest the organism that they're attacking. And malaria being a case of that. The fungi? Well, the fungi are simply, again, digesting living cells and destroying them. Basically, the response of the body to the damage is the symptoms that we see for this disease. I've left the last one, which is bacteria, to last here, because bacteria basically are damaging host cells, breaking down cell membranes, and if that's all they did, it probably wouldn't be quite so bad. But what they do is they tend to produce toxins in this breaking down of the membranes, and it's these toxins that seem to do the damage. Some damage sort of enzymes, some inactivate enzymes, some interfere with the host cell's genetic material so that the cells can't divide, and these toxins that are produced are simply a byproduct. In fact, while we're talking about that, I suppose some fungi can easily produce toxins as well, and that gives the symptoms of the disease. So here are our basic modes of action for the viruses, the protists, the fungi and the bacteria. Once inside a cell, it's very much harder to destroy some of these things, and some microbacteria are known for living in cells. Fungi, being different, are like bacterium, are possible to destroy. Protists, being very, very similar, are much, much harder to sort of cause destruction to. Right, okay, so that's, if you like, a little overview of what the things are. Now let's start going to have a look at plants and what we can actually do to sort of look at plant diseases. If we look at perhaps England's most favourite sort of and significant tree, here it's the oak, and they live for centuries. There are in fact quite a lot of different types of oak, and they are home for hundreds of different insects. They're home for many different lichen, and they are really familiar sort of plants that we see growing in the English countryside. Here I'm looking at the woodland trust, and they've got some rather nice sort of pictures of the oak tree to give you some idea of them. So English oak, very common with its acorns and particularly significantly shaped leaves. Now these oak are under attack. There is a disease having a go at them. Now, what's the problem? Well, it's really easy to see that the oak tree might be being damaged, but trying to identify what is actually causing the damage is a lot more difficult. Sometimes we get sort of particular things on the leaves. We can see that they've got particular marks. Here, this is also gall wasps appearing on oak trees. But from about the 1980s, oak trees have basically been sort of dying. This acute oak decline first appeared, as I said, in the 1980s, and we've got a dark fluid oozing from the bark, and the tree starts to decline and dies. And what causes it? Well, it's very difficult to try and have a look. Could it be an unknown bacteria? Could it be a particular beetle, such as the oak jewel beetle? They could just, however, be the vector. And what we've got to try and do is study oak trees and the ones that are infected to try and have a look and see what's going on. So there are lots and lots of different diseases here, and we see various sort of ways of trying to cure them. It's not particularly easy to try and have a look at. So if we look at a plant, then basically we've got to try and identify what we've got. So we might have perhaps some sort of bacterial infection, and we can see this with particular bacteria that might affect things like potatoes, tomatoes, aubergines. There's a gram-positive bacteria that can affect those, and this causes something which we've seen, which is called ring rot. And once you've got this infected, then we can't use the ground that's got this, because this bacteria is going to stay in the ground for up to sort of a couple of years. Common one for viruses is perhaps tobacco mosaic virus. Probably one of the best known. This affects, of course, tobacco plants and quite a lot of other things like tomatoes and peppers and cucumbers and petunias and various other plants, and it damages the leaves, the fruits, flower, stunting growth, and there is no cure for this apart from burning the infected stuff. More's known about this because of affecting tobacco plants and the tobacco industry. If we look at a fungal infection here, then we might be looking at something like, I don't know, potato blight. And this is a fungus. The hyphae here penetrate the host cells. They destroy the leaves, the tubers, the fruit, and they cause millions of pounds worth of crop damage each year. There's no cure, but we are starting to get plants that are resistant to this. There's also a big problem with something like bananas. there's a fungal infection that attacks and destroys the leaves of bananas. And bananas give us a big problem. You see, if we've got a banana, we need to know something about the banana. And the banana basically doesn't have any seeds. Bananas are grown in probably around 130 odd countries where they're a major economic cash crop. And if this banana is infected by something, then we've got a real big problem. Places like East Africa, bananas are a staple food, but most of them are basically cultivated, produced on small farms, and they are basically then exported to the Western supermarkets. Now, if we've got some sort of fungus affecting this, because this plant doesn't reproduce in the way that all the other plants do, but they reproduce basically by sort of man-made systems of trying to clone them, then our problem is very simple, that this one fungus could possibly wipe out the entire world supply of bananas. And that's a sobering thought, to think that one disease can actually cause all that problem and devastate just not one crop, but one complete organism here could completely disappear. And that's the food staple for, a lot of the world. Big problem. So what can we do about this? Well, it's a fungus, and fungi in plants very hard to get rid of. We can grow disease-proof versions. But here we've got a banana which is basically cloned, and this is a lot more difficult to sort of deal with. So what's our next problem? Well, let's have a look at some animals and see where we go with animals. There are a whole series of animal diseases, and one of these which affects humans and animals is TB. And TB affects huge populations, and we get an awful lot of UK cattle that they had to be destroyed in about 2013 because of bovine TB. And bovine TB was passed by this little creature, the European badger. And so farmers wanted to have a terrific number of these culled, because literally they are the vector for this disease. So culling all these sort of badgers sounds like a way of trying to solve the problem, but basically you're trying to get rid of the vector rather than the disease. And although it can work, it's a little bit unfair on the poor little badger, who was just the sort of innocent vector here carrying the disease around. So let's look at animals. We've got then tuberculosis, TB. TB damages lungs, and it's a disease of humans, but also of most of our livestock. Humans, yeah, but cows, pigs, badgers and deer often get this. And TB, as well as damaging the lungs, basically it suppresses the immune system. And doing this means that you can't fight off other diseases. In 2012, 8.6 million people had TB, and in 2012 1.3 million died. So problems with this disease, but some ways it's not as important as some other ones which seem to be killing more people. But if you've got a large population with perhaps something like HIV, then this population is more likely to get tuberculosis. And in people, tuberculosis is curable and it can be prevented. But TB is adapting and becoming resistant. Now, what do we do about these poor little badgers? Some people feel culling is not an acceptable approach. Vaccination of the cattle might be a better route. Basically, the tests for TB can't distinguish between an infected animal and a vaccinated animal. Now, while we were in the EU, Britain in the EU, EU law banned cattle vaccine, but hopefully now we're out, now we can use cattle vaccines. The problem of TB in animals isn't going to be easily solved, but we are making some progress with this. Are there any other nasty diseases? Well, yeah, let's move along. And animals, we've got TB, we've mentioned HIV, and this is related to AIDS, basically an acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. Now, this HIV virus targets particular cells. It targets the T helper cells. And more of this in our next video. Basically, it gradually destroys the immune system, so affected people are basically open to, well, every other infection, such as, well, TB. And this is a particularly nasty thing to try and deal with, because we can also get pneumonia and some sorts of cancers. Now, HIV is a retrovirus. Very similar in that respect, I suppose, to the coronavirus. And this is an RNA virus. Basically, it transcribes RNA into a single strand of DNA to produce a single strand of DNA in the host cell. And this DNA interacts with the cellular material, the genetic material, and off it goes. Basically, HIV is difficult to transmit because normally it's done by simple body fluids, and that means sharing of this disease normally happens basically through unprotected sex, sharing of needles, contaminated blood, and especially mothers can giving it to their babies during birth or breastfeeding. And we're looking at some figures. The bulk of the ones I could find are 2012, looking at about 35 million people worldwide with HIV, and about 1.6 million of those dying of the disease. There's no vaccine, no cure. People worry about this coronavirus, but here we've got a disease where we've been working on a vaccine for several years and still nothing here. We've got various other practices which cause an increase in HIV, and this is sort of prevalent in certain cultures, and this means that this rises. Moving on from HIV, a major killer. Influenza. Influenza, a virus of, in fact, something called the ciliated epithelial cells. Now, this means that it kills these cells, airways are open to secondary infection, and flu is fatal to young children, old people, and people with diseases. Other people are just sort of ill. Now, we see a lot of interesting strains of these, and we see particular ones like swine flu. Now, what is something like swine flu? Well, let's have a think about what goes on. Now, there's a lot of stuff done at the moment on COVID-19, and what we see, and here's an article from Harvard University on COVID-19 and about the emerging viral diseases and the journey they take from animals to humans. It's a thing that's really relevant, that we've got this idea that we've got a reservoir host. This somehow goes into an intermediate host, maybe the bat to the pangolin, and then somehow it gets out into the human population, and then this virus again shifts. It's called zoonotic shift. Zoonotic shift is simply a way that we can basically get one sort of animal and it undergoes some sort of hop into humans. Now, basically the humans need to be exposed either to the animal in some way, and this could be with a pet, or as happens in places like China where they seem to store lots of different animals together, is a possibility, or again it can do this by accident, by being released perhaps from a lab into a population. Who knows at the moment, at this time in July 2020, of knowing what actually happened. Only time will answer this question. But the animal somehow can allow this virus to hop from animal to human, and then we need to get another mutation, and in this mutation then it's able to go from human to human, and this is what we're looking at with something like COVID-19. COVID-19 really is sort of quite frightening at the moment. Here's this day's data from the Johns Hopkins University in America. How many cases worldwide? 13 million. And the global deaths here, 578. And looking at this, we're still looking at the UK being probably the third highest, although I don't think that's going to stay like that for long. We're looking at the UK putting up a figure of all deaths in all places, and a lot of other countries massaging figures so they don't appear quite so bad. That is up to political debate. So we've got a lot of this information, and it's worthwhile trying to track this to have a look at how things move on. Looking at the critical trends in COVID-19, it's sort of looking sort of not really very good. We're looking at how the curves have sort of gradually changed, and it's not looking particularly good. So what can we do here? So this idea of zoonotic diseases, such as perhaps obviously coronavirus, but also influenza. So we've got this swine flu, and we're hearing stories about this sort of stuff happening still out in China. Many of these diseases seem to start in China, but it's not always there. In March 2009, a small village in Mexico became infected with a new disease, and a few died. Some of those that were infected were infected with a particular type of flu. It was called the H1N1 flu, and it was found in pigs. And somehow it had managed to cross into humans. The outbreak spread to the US, where DNA analysis technique worked out that this was a mutant strain of this H1N1 swine flu virus, and it hadn't been seen before in pigs, and of course it hadn't been seen before in humans, and that causes lots of sort of problems. So once this had started getting hold, 5 months later 3,000 people in the world had died. The good news is they managed to produce a vaccine, but we have to guess that between 200,000 and 300,000 people died as a result of this infection. And we're seeing now with this COVID-19 that outbreak is basically just as bad, in fact really worse, because as I gave you the figures today, we're looking at 578,000 deaths from COVID-19 so far. And from what we see, this is far from ended. We're seeing this graph go still up. We're looking at some countries getting a hold of this and looking at the figures, sort of the growth curves gradually coming down. But all of those countries seem to be worried about now a second wave. Some countries have got their second wave already, and others are bracing for it. They have a choice. Do they sort of release the population from this outbreak and try to recover, or do they afford just to go bankrupt? Safe and bankrupt gives problems, or you try and sort of battle it through and hope for the best. I think that's more the system the United States is using. Or you're going to take a sort of a halfway approach, lock down and then release, and try and put in measures, which is what most of Europe and some other countries have done, and that so far seems reasonably successful, but only time must tell for that. I hope you've learnt a little bit about these pandemics and these different types of diseases that we suffer. We'll have a look and see next time what we can actually do, what the body does to try and solve these problems. If you like this, give us a thumbs up, and please, if you like it, then please subscribe, and you'll get more as we go along. We do these each week. So until then, if you found this quite useful, then I'll see you again on A-level biology, topic by topic. I'll see you next week. Take care. Bye bye.